Hello humans, welcome back to the study of the Bible in chronological order. Today is Genesis chapter 25, verses 27 to 34. So Genesis chapter 25, verses 27 to 28 begins by informing us that while the twins grew up, Esau became an outdoorsman, a skillful hunter, whereas Jacob became a mild person of quiet temperament who preferred to stay inside the comfort of his own tent. It says that Isaac loved and favored Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game that Esau brought home. However, Rebekah loved and favored Jacob. And so this information immediately sets the stage for conflict due to a divided house out from favoritism. Now, as a side note, it is written that Isaac favored Esau due to him being an outdoorsman, a hunter, right? And so it is also written that Ishmael was an archer who was accustomed to living life in the wilderness. Remember back in Genesis 21, verse 20. Therefore, Isaac's admiration for outdoorsmen, or like a manly man, might also be another reason why Isaac and Ishmael managed to work together in order to bury Abraham in Genesis 25, verse 9. Just a thought. Anyway, returning to the twins. So in chapter 25, verses 29 to 30, it informs us that at some point on some day, Esau returned home from an apparent unsuccessful hunt. Exhausted and hungry, he begged Jacob for the red stew he made. Now, this emphasis on the stew being red becomes the reason for Esau's other name, his nickname, Edom, or Edom. And that means red. However, it's also most likely the reason why Esau was described as red when he was born in chapter 25, verse 25. Now, the word red used to describe Esau at birth is the Hebrew admoni. And the word red used to describe Jacob's stew is Adom. And then his nickname, Edom, is Edom. So Adom, Edom. Now, all three of those words, they come from the root word Adam. Adam. And that means to be or to appear red. Now, if you remember, the name Adam derives from that word as well. It is written as the word Adam. Adam. So, but what does Adam have to do with the color red? I don't know, but blood is red. And as we already saw in Genesis 9:4, the Lord told Noah and his family that blood is equated with life, and so that they were not to consume the blood. In fact, later on in Leviticus chapter 17 and Deuteronomy chapter 12, the Israelites will be told and reminded not to consume blood because the blood is life. Further, if you remember, back in Genesis 4:10, after Cain murdered Abel, God said to Cain, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." Therefore, blood is life. Blood is red. Adam, man, describes the red life within the body, and Esau's nickname, Edom, is a play on words which means red. Why? Well, it is written in chapter 25, verses 31 to 34, that after Esau begged for the red stew, Jacob, seeing a rare opportunity to take advantage of his brother, he told Esau that he could have this red stew only if he sold or transferred his birthright to him in a trade. Esau, claiming to be famished to the point of being near death, he swore an oath to Jacob, and then he ate a good meal, and he went on his way. And thus it is written at Genesis 25:34, Esau despised his birthright. But what exactly is a birthright? Well, the birthright consists of the material blessings of a father being passed on to his sons. By right, the oldest son received a double portion of the inheritance received by the children. We're going to see this in Deuteronomy chapter 21. Also, we'll see it in Luke chapter 15. Jesus will mention this and talk about it. But this birthright is often connected to, but needs to be distinguished from, the blessing. The blessing generally involved more of a focus on a spiritual allotment, but it crossed paths with the birthright with respect to future leadership and authority of the person. We're actually going to see this in Genesis chapters 27 and again in chapter 49. Royal succession was also a birthright, though God could countermand this privilege if he desired to. And we're actually going to see that in 1 Samuel chapter 23, like with God giving David the kingdom instead of it being passed on to Saul's son Jonathan. All right? In Genesis chapter 25, verses 29 to 34, Esau willingly sold or transferred his birthright to Jacob, which, as we will soon see in chapter 27, forfeits his blessing. Esau made an impulsive decision to give Jacob his birthright, a double portion of the family inheritance and position of future family leader, for some red stew, even though his birthright was never even really his to give away. By trading his birthright for some stew, Esau displayed contempt for the blessing God had given to him. What Esau despised is the very thing Jacob desired, because he recognized its value, and he only missed out on it by seconds, because he was not the firstborn, right? Esau came out first. Esau did not grasp the significance of all that God had promised to fulfill through the unique line descended from Abraham, of which he was the natural heir as the firstborn. Esau did not appreciate that his birthright was linked to God's plan of redemption for the whole world. But Jacob did, and so he grasped at his heel. Now, consequently, Esau traded a long-term benefit or blessing for short-term pleasure, and it negatively affected his life. Now, although he will later swear at Jacob in chapter 27, here in this story, he is content to swear to Jacob. Now listen, it's easy for people to read Esau's story, to look down on him, and believe themselves to be better than Esau, but is this situation really so uncommon? It would be wise for us to take Jesus' advice in this, for us to first examine ourselves before we make a quick judgment about Esau. So, right? I mean, let's take the plank out of our eye before we can even try to remove the speck from somebody else's. Have you ever traded long-term blessing for short-term pleasure? I mean, think about it. Have you ever indulged in sexual relations prior to marriage in order to appease a short-term appetite in your pursuit for pleasure? If so, you traded a long-term benefit blessing, keeping your virginity, your purity sacred and holy for your partner in marriage for a short-lived thrill. Have you ever spoken terrible words in the heat of the moment to satisfy your pride, only for those words to cause lasting damage to the relationship and for you to live in regret of those words later on? Have you ever given in to your desire for destructive drugs? Listen, I mean, even if you have not yet experienced the long-term consequences of your decision to secure short-term satisfaction, you most assuredly will sooner or later. Many people have lived out this Esau syndrome. We can avoid making this mistake by comparing short-term satisfaction with its long-range consequences prior to making a decision and putting that decision into action. Our desires can demand our attention so much that we often magnify them in our field of focus. And so I call this the aperture appetite. So in photography, Four main factors will determine if the background is blurry, leaving only what is in the foreground solely in focus. Have you ever seen those photographs, those pictures? Whatever is in the foreground is in focus, but everything in the background is completely blurry. So four factors will determine if this is the case. One is aperture. A wide aperture equals a narrow or shallow depth of focus. Number two, the distance from the subject all the way to the background. So the greater the distance between the subject and the background, the blurrier the background will be. Number three is the distance between the lens and the subject. The closer the lens is to the subject, the blurrier the background will be. And then four is the optical length of your lens, but all humans have the same lens. So, putting all of this together, if a person's focus on a specific item or person is shallow and narrow, the details of the surrounding scenario will be difficult to ascertain. The distance from the subject to the background will always be great because the distance between a person's life here on earth is a great distance away from the new life in eternity. If a person is literally too close to a subject, the surroundings will not be in the frame and will thus be unknown. Esau's focus narrowed to the shallowness of the surface situation, and he did not consider the surrounding scenario. The distance between Esau's future and his present situation was great, and not taking the great distance into account, he made the mistake of allowing his lens to get too close to the subject. And because Esau was too close to the temptation, allowed himself to have a narrow focus on that temptation, the background of eternal consequences became blurred. The unfortunate part about a blurred background is that deception blends in with the rest of the blurred details. It's kind of hard to make out what's in that blurred background. Therefore, Jacob's deceitfulness went undetected because Esau's desire dominated over his discernment. This is aperture appetite. But what about you? Is your temptation in your frame at all? Hello. If it is, do you start to make it the point of focus? Do you draw closer and closer to your temptation while keeping your focus on it? So I want you to imagine this example of an aperture appetite in action. So within a man's frame, there exist multiple items, multiple people in a particular place, okay? In this frame, an attractive female with flirtatious facial features exists. The man narrows his focus onto the specific depth of field for the female's features. The man then draws closer and closer to the female until the man's frame consists of only the female in focus and everything else is just a blurred background. Now, unfortunately for the man, in that blurred background is that female's innocent yet ignorant husband. The female might be married, but because her husband is not in the man's field of focus, that husband's feelings, his future, will not be considered to be important. In fact, what I just described is pretty much what we will see later on in 2 Samuel chapter 11, when David's focus on Bathsheba leaves her husband, Uriah, in the blurred background to be buried. Acts of adultery are examples of aperture appetite in action. Consider this also. In the blurred background of that same scenario that I just described, let's say there was a homeless woman sitting on the curb. She was hungry, she was cold, but because that woman was in the blurred background, well, her feelings, her future, they're not going to be considered to be important either. Sometimes it's good to narrow our focus. Sometimes it's good for us to examine someone or something closely, in detail. However, we should be able to see the bigger picture most of the time. In fact, both are necessary for Bible study. So while it is important for us to obtain precise focus on a particular word, verse, passage, or story, we also need the ability to be able to zoom out to see how each word, verse, passage, or story fits into the entire salvation story. Ultimately, we need to set our sights on the Lord, keep our focus on heavenly things rather than the ways of this world, right? And so, for this particular story of Esau despising his birthright, the details help us to realize the bigger picture of how and why Jacob will take center stage in the genealogical line from Abraham, so that we will eventually see how this will all lead to Jesus. And so, let's end with some questions to consider. What are you willing to trade for the thing or person you desire? Do you ever find yourself willing to negotiate anything for immediate pleasure? Does your spouse, your children, your integrity, body, or soul get included in these damning deals? Do you sometimes feel that the important parts of life escaped while you were grabbing for your desires? Who or what is in your frame? Where is your focus? How many important things or people might be in your blurred background that actually need to come into focus? How many things or people are in focus that actually belong in your blurred background? So, until next time, consider if the trade is worth it, and pray that the Lord will help you shift your focus in your aperture appetite.